Imagine, a 13-year-old boy with leprosy rules over Crusader Jerusalem and becomes one of the greatest kings of his time. Baldwin IV was born in 1161 in the very center of the crusading world, in Jerusalem. His father, Amory I, was a king who had to simultaneously brandish a sword and conduct diplomatic conversations. His mother, Agnes de Courtenay, from a family of Frankish aristocrats, had a respectable reputation at court. However, family happiness was short-lived. The couple divorced when Baldwin was still very young. The boy's upbringing was no longer the responsibility of one of his parents, but of the political system itself. Not very warm, but quickly taught him how to survive. Baldwin was cared for by Archbishop William of Tyre, an educated man, Chancellor of the Kingdom, and at the same time a chronicler who saw and wrote down everything. The boy grew up not in the arms of his parents, but surrounded by courtiers and churchmen. And then, an unpleasant surprise. It turned out that Baldwin did not feel pain. At first it seemed like a trick. You play knights, you scratch your hand until it bleeds, and you're fine. But the doctors quickly realized that it was leprosy. The disease is serious, incurable, and in those days it was almost a sentence. When he was 13 years old, his father died, and then, bang, Baldwin becomes king. 13 years old and already a crown. And not nominally, the boy really enters the game. Not only sits on the throne, but also takes part in military campaigns. Really fights for his state. But self-government of a 13-year-old teenager is a risky thing. Therefore, the barons and churchmen decided to appoint a regent. The choice fell on Raymond III of Tripoli, an experienced count, a relative of the royal family. He had experience, authority, and a reputation for being able to negotiate. Once he even sat in Muslim captivity, after which he became a little more cautious, but no less useful for that. He was the temporary ruler of the state until the young king grew up. And in the year 1175, Raymond made peace with Saladin, a wise decision at the time. I think you want to know more about this guy. So Salah ad-Din, or simply Saladin, was not just a sultan. He became a legend during his lifetime, a commander, strategist, empire builder. But most importantly, he was a man of ideas, to unite Muslim lands and return Jerusalem to Islam. His path began in Egypt, where he established himself as a vizier and later actually took power. Not having an aristocratic origin, Saladin conquered Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Hijaz. Modest in everyday life, faithful to religion but without fanaticism, he knew how to build not only armies but also a system. Even his enemies respected him. Western chroniclers, who led active hostilities against Muslims, wrote about Saladin with amazement and respect. He did not mock prisoners, did not seek glory at any cost. Tough, but not cruel. Resolute, but not blind. For Baldwin IV, Saladin was not just an adversary. He was a challenge, a mirror, the other side of the same coin. Both were leaders torn between physical weakness and political responsibility. Both knew that time was short, and that was why they acted without unnecessary delay. This was not just war, this was a strategic duel, a game of chess between a king in armor and a commander in a turban. And what about Baldwin? Some might have thought that while the regent was in power, the young king was only watching from the sidelines. But Baldwin did not want to be a paper king. From an early age, he was interested in politics, participated in meetings, learned to lead not only the army but also the state. His body was already beginning to betray him, but his will was only getting stronger. 1176, Baldwin is 15. He announces the end of Raymond of Tripoli's regency. From now on, there will be no more shadowy rule. The young king takes matters into his own hands. Unlike the cautious Raymond, Baldwin understands that defense is not an option. Against Saladin, you cannot sit in castles. You have to act ahead of time. So he chooses a risky but offensive strategy. First, strengthen his entourage. He rejects ambitious contenders and chooses those who are loyal. Then comes quick, local strikes. Raids in the Damascus area. The devastation of the Bekaa Valley. These are not conquests, but signals. Jerusalem will not be silent, even when it seems weak. 1177. Baldwin concludes an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Comnenus. The plan is desperate, a joint strike on Egypt, the heart of Saladin's state. However, time is against them. Saladin acts first. In the same year, he suddenly invades the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The forces are unequal. The enemy has a significant advantage. But Baldwin does not run away. He gathers the remnants of the army, a few hundred knights, infantry, what has survived. He himself can hardly walk, but he mounts a horse and sets off on a campaign. First, the defense of Ascalon, then the decisive encounter near Ramla at the Battle of Montgessard. This is not a victorious march. This is a risky blow on the verge of despair. But it turns out to be timely. The enemy troops do not expect such an attack. Saladin is forced to retreat, having suffered serious losses. Victory is important, but not absolute. It does not decide the war, it only postpones it. Baldwin saved the kingdom, but could not stop the threat. After Montgessard, the young king finally becomes a figure to be reckoned with. Leprosy progresses. He loses his sight, his hands tremble, his body weakens. But his mind remains sharp as a blade, and his will does not fade. Yes, he is 16. Yes, he is a leper. And yes, he won. What could be more motivating than a king who is literally falling apart, but still leads the battle? In 1178, both sides sign a truce. That same year, seeking to strengthen the border, Baldwin orders the construction of the fortress of La Châtellier on the Jordan River, a strategic point that was supposed to deter further attacks by Muslims. But already in the summer of 1179, tensions are rising again. Peace is bursting at the seams. Baldwin and Saladin, like experienced rivals, continue their dangerous chess game, and Saladin makes the move. He unexpectedly delivers a powerful blow. The new fortress of the Crusaders, La Châtellier, falls under the pressure of his troops. Soon, near Marj Ayoun, an open clash takes place. The Crusaders suffer a heavy defeat. Baldwin is almost taken prisoner. He manages to escape from the hands of the enemy. This time, he returns to the ranks, but not as a triumphant, but as one who has looked death in the face. And he learned a bitter lesson from this. In these difficult times, Baldwin understands the war with Saladin is not only a clash of armies, but also a complex diplomacy and struggle for influence within the kingdom. To strengthen his position, he organizes the marriage of his sister Sybil with Guy de Lusignan, an influential knight from Poitou, a vassal of the Plantagenet dynasty. This alliance, concluded in 1880, becomes not just a political gesture, but a strategic step. But the disease does not give the king peace. Leprosy progresses, and Baldwin is forced to transfer part of the power to his sister's new husband. And although Guy formally takes on some of the responsibility, it is Baldwin who continues to keep the kingdom afloat, despite intrigues, the struggle for the throne, and internal tensions. The war continues. In 1182, Baldwin and Guy strike Saladin's troops near Beirut. This victory allows for another truce, which brings a temporary respite. Throughout this period, Baldwin behaves like an experienced chess player playing blitz blindfolded. The kingdom does not fall because it is held by the will of a man whose body gives up positions every day, but whose mind remains sharp. However, the threat looms not only from without. Inside Jerusalem, a storm of its own is brewing. Guy de Lusignan, the king's son-in-law, does not meet expectations. His ambitions outstrip his real abilities. Some see him as a potential successor, others as a direct threat to stability. And his alliance with Sybil only adds to the tension. They say she was the slightly wiser of the two. On the other side is Count Raymond III of Tripoli, a former regent and still an influential baron. His loyalty has always been cautious. To some, a wise strategist, to others, a master of backstage games waiting for the right moment. And between them is Baldwin, a leper king forced to balance the ambitions of his loved ones and threats from outside. His every decision is like a move on a razor's edge. In 1183, Baldwin is about 20. He is already blind, unable to walk on his own, his body almost completely destroyed. But it is now, in the most intense pain, that he makes the most important decisions of his reign. The palace is tense. Sibylla insists that her husband, Guy de Lusignan, should become the heir. But Baldwin does not trust him. He has already given him a chance. He made him regent when he himself lost his sight. And what did Guy do? The worst. When the Muslims besieged the fortress of Krak, Guy did not even go to help. Couldn't he? Didn't he want to? This remained unanswered, but the siege ended in disgrace, and the shadow of that humiliation fell on the entire kingdom. Baldwin does not hold back. He deprives Guy of his titles, removes him from his positions, and effectively banishes him to Ascalon. But the kingdom could not remain without a future. And then Baldwin took an extraordinary step. On November 20th, 1183, he crowned his young nephew, Baldwin of Montferrat, as co-king, Baldwin V. The boy was only 9 years old, but there was no other way out. It was the last chance to keep the throne away from Guy of Lusignan. This ceremony was not just a ritual, it was a signal to all the barons, European allies, and even Saladin himself. There was a legitimate heir in Jerusalem. The royal bloodline continued, even if it was supported by a boy being carried on a stretcher. To prevent any of the internal players from seizing power, Baldwin created a council of guardians. And, paradoxically, he brought Raymond III of Tripoli back into politics, his former regent. Yes, the same one who had once held power for too long and was in no hurry to give it up. But now, it was the lesser of two evils. Raymond became regent for the young king. Although many doubted his intentions, Baldwin simply had no options left. Each baron pulled the blanket over himself, and the intrigues in the palace were worse than Saladin's swords. Baldwin still formally ruled. Although he was blind and half dead, every decision remained his. Spring 1185. Baldwin IV is only 23, and he looks like an old man, blind, exhausted. The king ceased to rule not because of reluctance, as some might think, but because of impossibility. The disease no longer allowed him to move. Power passed completely to the little Baldwin V, a boy who was still learning to hold a pen but already wore a crown. Raymond remained as regent. Baldwin IV, the Ghost King, was seen less and less in the palace. He spent his last days in the shadows, where he was almost unrecognizable. People only whispered, "Is this him?" And the end came. Without speeches, without tears, without victory, and without surrender. He simply disappeared. Amidst blood, intrigue, victories, leprosy, and politics, Baldwin IV died. His body could no longer hold the burden that his soul refused to let go.